Thank you, Jane, and thanks to everybody for coming out on this Friday night for what promises to be a very interesting and provocative discussion. Ours is an age of unparalleled freedom to publish and share ideas. Digital technology, however, has also created new challenges and gatekeepers. Some of these are direct and obvious, but many others operate stealthily through the invisible hand of the market or obscured by a smokescreen of corporate, social, and political rationales. Each year, an unknown number of books never gets published for these reasons, and their absence is barely noticed by the general public. This discussion will examine why this happens and how these vanished books affect our freedom to read. Joining us tonight from the right, on the right-hand stage of the stage.
It's not an identification.
No. Is Stephen Henighan. Stephen is the author of 6 books of fiction and 4 books of nonfiction. He is a columnist for Geist magazine, a contributor to the Times Literary Supplement, and general editor of the Biblioasis International Translation Series. Stephen Henighan.
From the right.
In the middle of the stage is Hal Niedzviecki. Hal is a writer, speaker, cultural commentator, and editor whose work challenges preconceptions and confronts readers with the offenses of everyday life. He's the author of 8 books, including the collection of short stories, Look Down, This Is Where It Must Have Happened, and the nonfiction book, The Peep Diaries, How We're Learning to Love Watching Ourselves and Our Neighbors. He's the current fiction editor and the founder of Broken Pencil Magazine, the magazine of zine culture and the independent arts. Hal Niedzviecki.
Hello.
And finally, right to my right, Jesse Hirsh. Jesse is an internet strategist, researcher, and broadcaster based in Toronto. He has a weekly nationally syndicated column on CBC Radio explaining and analyzing the latest trends and developments in technology using language and examples that are meaningful and relevant to everyday life. Jesse Hirsh. Now that we have the introductions out of the way and we all know each other, I wanted to start off with this scenario. Let's pretend I've written a book, yet I can't find a traditional publisher, which is something that faces many writers. If I want, I can upload it and it'll be on sale on Amazon or Kobo within minutes. This seems to me like we're living in a golden age of publishing. So how can we be talking about gatekeepers and censorship when we figured out ways around traditional barriers? Stephen?
Well, you're still talking about gatekeepers because I think that if we're talking about literature, we also have to talk about, we can talk about people uploading their books on the internet, but are you just dumping it? It's the equivalent of dumping. Before, if the novel didn't get published, you might at some stage get frustrated and dump it in the garbage. Now you dump it online, but not that many more people are going to see it unless it has the institutional support. The other issue that I think is very important is just freedom of information, because without freedom of information, you don't actually have freedom of expression in any form. And freedom of information is still quite closely controlled in many cases. I mean, we've seen a case recently where Canada's scientists working in the Arctic now have to sign an agreement not to publicize any of their results in case those results might show that climate change might actually be happening, which, of course, the Canadian government's position is that it is not happening. And so you cannot work as a scientist in the Canadian Arctic unless you agree to suppress your freedom of speech in that matter. On the whole, though, I think what has happened with globalization is that like everything else, the gatekeeper has been privatized. So it's no longer the Soviet commissar who will send you to Siberia if you write the wrong thing, although there are still countries where that does happen, but it tends to come from a private sector point of view. And one of the eeriest examples for me happened a few months ago when, for years, we've been talking about the tar sands, the Alberta tar sands, the Alberta tar sands. Suddenly the oil industry said, we don't want you to write that anymore. We want you to say oil sands. And every newspaper in the country leapt into line within a week. The few columnists who went against that, someone like Jeffrey Simpson, who's a very moderate, middle-of-the-road kind of commentator, but he's done a lot of research on it, and he started writing something like the oil sands, or the tar sands, or if you prefer, the oil sands. And then he was forced to change that. And he now writes bitumen as his way around it. And that's a kind of resistance to the corporate censorship that's been imposed on our media. But it is a private censorship that is beginning to take over from the public, I would say.
How?
For a long time, when I started Broken Pencil, which is a magazine devoted to sort of underground and independent publishing, and there was a mission there, which was that there was corporate censorship of ideas, particularly in a North American context, that we wanted to fight against. And yet, at a certain point, I realized that it wasn't so much corporate censorship of ideas, because any idea is potentially saleable when packaged in the right way. So I started to think to myself, well, what is this magazine exactly about? And then, right around the time I started to have this quandary, which is, I was illustrating by scratching my hair. That's a I don't know, something. The internet came into full bloom, and all of a sudden it became apparent that anyone could have a web page, and then very quickly after that, anyone could have a blog, a Facebook page, Twitter, and all these things were broadcast friendly, you to many, theoretically. And so I was forced to kind of rethink a major chunk of what I had been kind of fighting for, because I quickly realized that nothing was actually changing, and this became, such a quandary in my mind. How could it be that thing that I had always sort of talked about and dreamed about in paper form? I had always said, well, if everyone did a zine, if everyone felt like they could have the opportunity to be heard, we would have a much better society and a much better culture. And I remember a woman coming up to me at a zine fair. Zines, for those who don't know the nomenclature, are kind of short form for the magazine, and the zine is like a little self-made, homemade magazine, usually photocopied. And this woman was in her 70s, and we were at this thing, and she said, "What is this thing, zine?" And so I explained it to her, and she told me, I think we were in Stratford or some small Ontario town, and she told me that for the last decade she had been writing letters to the newspaper. And the newspaper had never published a single one. Now, I can only imagine what they said. And so she said to me, having learned about this thing, the zine, I'm going to take all my letters and I'm going to make a zine. And I said, that's terrific. If everyone did that, we would be in a better place. And now here we are, and everyone is doing that, and yet we do not seem to be in a better place. So I'm going to leave it at that. I think is I'm pretty sure we're going to get deeper into this and pass it over to Jesse.
I think there's a difference, though, between everyone doing that and everyone could do that. And we're in a state where everyone could do that, which I think, to go back to your question, I need to step back and say, well, who gets to be a writer? Mm-hmm. Who gets to write a book? I mean, I think there's a false assumption that you write the book first and then sell it. Because it takes a lot of economic resources to write a book. It takes a lot of time to write a book. Explicitly, it's privilege. And when you see who writes the books, it's usually people who, they have a law degree, they were a doctor, they have some basis by which they might self-finance, versus the professional writer who might sell it and get an advance and work with a publishing firm to make it happen. So there are still gatekeepers. There's just different gatekeepers, with some old gatekeepers and some new gatekeepers. And there is something called a lottery, aka the internet, in which a 1 out of some odd million chance, if you buy a ticket every week, you might win and have your content go viral. But in fact, that in and of itself, I think, is a myth. Both the myth that it is a flat, level playing field and or that it's meritocratic. Because the gatekeepers in the new era, I find, even more corrupt than the gatekeepers of the old era when it comes to either advancing their own personal agenda or playing favors with their social networks.
You use the word corrupt. How so?
Corrupt in the sense that power, especially in the sense that publishing is a cornerstone of power in any state, it by itself corrupts. And corrupts in the sense that whether it's your stated ideals or whether it's, in this context, the public discourse, other priorities come into play. And I personally, I'm someone who, as a professional intellectual, as someone who's paid to think and share those ideas, have deliberately and completely and entirely avoided the publishing world for the vast majority of my career, because I felt that it was corrupt and would not in any way provide an outlet for my ideas. And I say that because I feel that society as a whole is corrupt. And that it is very difficult to counter conventional thinking. Like I, for example, have repeatedly stated on public radio for over 20 years that the internet should be regulated by the government. And for the first 15 years saying that, people not only thought I was a loony, they would not acknowledge me saying it because it was such an absurd concept. And now that the majority of governments in the world are now regulating the internet, it's no longer a crazy idea, and yet when I say it, people still think it's an oxymoron, even though the majority of governments in the world, including Canada, regulate the internet.
Well, can you explain how the government regulates the internet? You say that, and I'm sure a lot of people raise their eyebrows. They don't realize that this goes on. Can you think of one or two examples?
Very briefly, because I don't want to get too far off our subject. There's three current models of internet regulation. The authoritarian model in China and Iran, which is very strict in terms of access and content. The North American, European model, which is based on copyright. If you violate copyright on the internet in the United States right now, you'll get kicked off the internet. So your right to communicate, your right to publish, is based upon your adherence to copyright laws that the vast majority of young people see as corrupt. And then the third model, I'm happy to say, the Brazilian model, is called, for the last 2 years, have been debating a civil rights framework of the internet that enshrines privacy, network neutrality, universal access, the role of libraries and schools into the actual framework of the legal institutions in Brazil. It's called, if you Google it, the Marco for civil framework of the internet. And there's a ton of great material out there. But all of which are clearly regulating the internet.
I want to get back to talking about the publishing industry specifically for a little bit. Because it seems to me a lot has been made of the industry's shift to quote-unquote a blockbuster model, similar to what has happened in the film industry, that publishers are only seeking out books that have a guaranteed audience, and if you are an author whose book or whose project doesn't fit that model, you're going to be out of luck, and you're going to have to, either go to a smaller press or you're going to have to self-publish your work. For example, right now, not a week goes by that I'm not getting a 50 Shades of Grey knockoff mailed to me. But my question is, playing devil's advocate, haven't publishers always wanted to sell books? I mean, why is this new model different from what they've always done? I mean, publishers have always wanted to pay the bills, always wanted to give authors advances, and if it takes them seeking out blockbusters, what's wrong with that?
I think that there has been a structural shift, however, that this is often cast in a rather sentimental, nostalgic vein, but it may still be somewhat true, and that is that the publishers used to be people who accepted the fact that they were going to make a 10% profit. Now they've been bought up by companies that aren't happy with the 10% profit. And so I think that's the essential shift that has occurred. What has gone along with that, and what writers such as the ones here and a couple of the ones who are out there probably lament, is the disappearance of the Midlist. And people talk a lot about the disappearance of the Midlist. Now, the Midlist, of course, is the average working novel, ones that aren't 50 Shades of Grey. And I think we need to think about that, and particularly in the Canadian context. I think it's happened a little bit differently than it has in some other places. And one thing that happened in the early stages was that we saw again and again some promising young writer produce a book of sort of pungent short stories about where she or he grew up. And then the next thing you heard was that after they'd won their first prize, they had signed with a major publisher and they were going to write a historical novel. And there's been this shying away from what's going on in our streets. And you can see it. There are still a few writers out there who write novels about contemporary life. Many of them have been dropped by the bigger publishers and are now with smaller publishers. But if you look at the Canadian fiction that has survived with the bigger publishers, most of it is set in the remote past or there's been this kind of folklorization of maritime Canada, which has allowed a few people like David Adams Richards to go churning out novel after novel in the same vein. And that has become the repository of all we used to think Canada was. And it's as though we're preserving that as a theme park, or at least a literary theme park. And we don't actually dare to feast our eyes on what's around us, which is actually really interesting. But we don't have, we have Zadie Smith writing about Northwest London. Well, who's writing about St. Clair West in Toronto?
But isn't that just publishers reacting to the demands of the marketplace? If there were a demand for anything other than historical fiction, as you say, wouldn't publishers be snapping these books up?
I think it's more complicated than that. I think there's a combination of structural industry factors and cultural factors. And one of the problems, which is both a real problem and a problem we imagine we have and probably don't have to the degree we imagine it, is that we think people won't recognize our reference points. So you can say, there's a feeling, and again, I don't think it's entirely true, but you talk to people, and I've spoken to 2 people in the last 6 months who've said that their agent told them to shift the Canadian scenes of their novel from Ontario to New York State. Mm-hmm. And there's a feeling that if you actually describe what you know, nobody will know what it is, because nobody knows who we are. And one of the problems with that is that it stifles not only, you can be concerned about that from a sort of identity point of view, and that's a legitimate concern, I think, but the even greater concern for me is that most artistic innovation comes out of some kind of engagement with a reality that hasn't been described before and therefore requires different literary techniques to describe it, or a reality that's a bit off-center. And so our literary engagement has been stifled. So it's not that I'm against historical novels per se. There are some I actually like, but it's that it becomes a very static model and stifles literary innovation.
I won't ask this question to Jesse because you feel publishing is corrupt, but for Hal and Stephen, who have you both published several books, have you had any first-hand experience that would suggest to you this model has changed? I mean, what kind of... Talk about that.
In terms of what, that the model has changed? Yes, I see it all around me. Where do I begin? In terms of my own experience, I've been published by small presses all through my career, so I have made numerous attempts to get represented by agents and published by big publishers, which haven't worked out. I
can loan you my manuscript, The Secret Life of Labradorian Bees. It's going to get you where you want to go, my friend.
I think your pushback, though, around whether there's market data that drives book procurement, I think it's a total myth. Because if we did live in this Amazon world where the cost of publishing were low, then it goes back to Stephen's point about the appetite of the parent owners of parent owners, that it's about margin. I mean, markets today are automated. It would be really easy to figure out how much a book's going to make and go, look, we're going to give you $2,000 because that's all we think your book's going to make. If it sells more later, great, you'll get paid. Versus this one we could do for $5,000 and this one we could do for $20,000. So micro purchasing by a large firm could easily be done, but it won't give them the margin. It could still be profitable, but it's not going to give them the type of return that the blockbuster does.
You're not going to get,
so the market's there, they just don't want to engage it.
Well, look, I want to go back to that question of what's changed and haven't the publishers always been like this? And I think that Steve made the great point. They're hungry. They want the margin. Where did that come from? It came from corporate consolidation. There were independent publishers that were big, that were not corporate owned. So then once you have corporations, you have stockholders, you have a hungry capitalist machine that couldn't care less about anything. They just, what is the return on Bertelsmann, which owns Random House and now owns Penguin? They don't care what, in Random House Canada, we didn't make as much money this year because we invested a lot of money in this incredibly important book that didn't, that we knew wasn't going to do that well. they'll be like, you're out. You know, they couldn't care less about that. And so you have consolidation. You have consolidation on the publishing front, and just as importantly, if not more so, you have consolidation on the retail front.
Yeah.
When I started Broken Pencil, the primary way the magazine reached people was through independent bookstores. Maybe we were distributing something along the lines of, say, 2,000 copies in Canada through independent bookstores, which it doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a small arts magazine. Now we distribute something along the lines of 400 copies in total to all of Canada. Why is that? Because there are no independent bookstores left, and because Chapters does not want us, and we do not want Chapters. So it's very easy to translate that into book terms, right?
Yeah.
If you have consolidation, you have essentially in Canada, you have one bookstore, Chapters Indigo. That's the only bookstore that matters. And then you have on the margins, and this is more so in the US, you have the big box stores, which are increasingly drivers of book sales. So you will go into your Costco and you will see literally a stack of 50 Shades of Grey up to the ceiling, discounted at a price that no other store could afford. Again, this is economic censorship, although it's not you wouldn't necessarily use the word censorship because it's not conscious. It's not a conscious attempt to repress an idea. They couldn't care less what's in the book. 50 Shades of Grey is a great example. We've got housewife bondage, sadomasochism. They couldn't care less what's in it. It's not about repressing ideas. It's about maximizing money. And how do you maximize money? You get a lot of people all over the world to all buy the same thing. That's not good for publishing. That's not good for me as a writer. And I don't want to monologue here, but I can go on to your next question. Have I personally felt the impact? And I have felt it considerably. Unlike Stephen, I started off with my career being published by, well, not started off, but I published with a small press with Coach House Books, and then I moved to Random House and Penguin, who both immediately dropped me because my books did not sell enough. Were they good books? I certainly think so. There's certainly enough, there's certainly enough reviews and so on to prove it. And to this day, I am outside looking in. I was probably, when I started publishing with those houses, I was in my 20s. I was young. I was foolish. I imagined that this was the beginning of a long-standing relationship and career with these firms. And I was probably a little too cavalier, too, in that I did not invest every waking moment of my life promoting those books, which is what I probably, what was expected of me to do. I didn't realize it at the time. I don't think they realized it at the time because that was the moment everything was changing, was 10, 15 years ago. And just recently, I'll end my monologue on this sober note, I had a book come out published by City Lights, a small press in San Francisco called The Peep Diaries, How I Learned to Love Watching Ourselves and Our Neighbors. Did phenomenally well, press-wise, media attention. It was made into a documentary. I appeared on, I would say, 30 CBC radio stations discussing this book, national media, tons of attention. I could not sell my next book to a corporate Canadian publisher. So the book that I then went back to them and said, look, this book did really, really well. Here's my next idea. This all happened in the last couple of months. They said, no, we're not interested. We acknowledge this is a great idea. We acknowledge your last book got tons of attention. However, we do not believe that the market can deliver this book. So what does this mean? In my life, it means less money. It means less time to write this book. It means it's not going to be as good a book as it could have been potentially. Well, not that it's not going to be as good a book. It's not going to be the same book that it could have been. These are the realities. I'm lucky enough that I do have a great publisher. that we'll fall back on. But again, you're not going to find that book in Chapters Indigo anytime soon, because that's, I was not anointed.
I wanted to go back to this idea of the Midlist. What's it going to mean for readers if and when a whole category of writers and writing disappears? Stephen?
Whoa. What do you mean by the category of writers and writing disappearing?
I mean, the Midlist, the writers who have, published 3 or 4 books, none of them have been broken out. Because based on what you're saying, what I'm seeing too firsthand, I mean, I know of dozens of writers who have been in that position where they've started with the Random House, they've started with the Penguin.
There's a whole generation.
And then suddenly, they're 45, 50 years old, they've supported themselves with writing for, 2 decades, and suddenly it's all gone. You're going to have this whole, I mean, what do you think?
What will happen? I mean, I think that, there was writers have often provided, I mean, what have writers served? Writers have served for various ends, and often it's been to consolidate a middle class, and often it's been to consolidate a national middle class, and I think national middle classes still exist in a certain way, but they're much more fluid and diffuse and globalized than they used to be. And so part of it is, I think, that there isn't a huge resistance to the disappearance of the Midlist, because the Midlist is no longer a banner of national identity, which it was in many countries, not just here. I mean, we think of the whole sort of Camlet nationalism in the 60s and so on here, but at different points in history that happened in a lot of countries, and because of that, writing became integrated into some sort of national culture, or it was part of being a civilized American that you had read Hemingway and Faulkner. It was part of being a civilized Brazilian that you'd read Machado de Assis or what have you. And so that category of cultural identification, which is a much bigger thing in a way than what we're talking about here, may be going, and that may be part of the reason why we're facing the crisis we're facing.
I wanted to talk a little bit about digitization and the rise of ebooks and how it feeds into this new model we're talking about. I guess I'll start with you, Jesse. When you look at the changes in publishing that we've been discussing, how much of that can we blame on ebooks?
Well, I think on the contrary, ebooks have given us a way out of blaming the internet. That for a long time the media industry blamed the internet as this mythical creature that threatened everyone's profits. And ebooks have demonstrated that no, in fact, it's quite easy to adapt and have a successful business model. So you are seeing, I think, a renewed courage, at least within the media industry, but particularly in the publishing industry. And I think for many people, I mean, to go back to the 70-year-old who had written letters to the editor, I mean, it is nice that self-publishing is able to become more and more established and more mature. It usually is someone who is in their 70s who has a lot of time to do it, so it still gets back down to my issue of privilege. But I have difficulty reconciling the notion of scarcity and the notion of e-publishing. Because I totally understand that if you're printing books and you have bookcases and you have libraries, that there's limits to what you can publish. But with ebooks, with the internet, I don't understand where scarcity is part of the picture. And I'd be happy in a totally separate event to talk about the absurdities of limiting libraries' lending of ebooks. But I want to come back to the idea of, I don't understand, like if I was Bertelsmann and I had just taken over Random House and Penguin, I would say to them, forget about your insider world of publishing. You're not media, you're a platform. Twitter doesn't tell anybody who can and cannot tweet. Neither should you. So find a way to publish the most amount of people in the most cost-effective way so that we own all that shit. And if one of them blows up, then we can be like Simon Cowell owning Susan Boyle and make sure that we get a cut. But instead, they all think of this world of artificial scarcity that actually I kind of understand where it's coming from, and it's that we all have the scarcity of time. Right? So 9 to 5, 5 days a week, and the editor says to themselves, I can only manage a certain amount of books. So I'm going to pick the books I like, and the books I think that will sell. So the corruption of personal bias, and the corruption of economic bias. rather than having the broader questions of what would be better for my brand? What would be better for my company? What would be long-term talent development and recruitment? All these things that would build a solid business, giving a solid return. But people don't think about that. Today, business is about shooting yourself in the foot and figuring out how you can keep your job and make sure you go on to the next.
But what you're proposing, what you're proposing Random House or Bertelsmann does, isn't that what Amazon is doing right now? They have created a platform where any writer can go and upload their novel within 5 minutes and have it in the world's biggest, digital bookstore.
I cannot reveal my sources, but I feel Amazon has no idea what it's doing. What Amazon is doing, that I absolutely respect, is trying everything. So they've got it all out there, and they are doing these things. But on the one hand, Amazon is buying up publishing houses. So it's becoming a totally vertically integrated content house.
Hiring editors.
Right.
They're trying to
So they're
open a
playing both
publishing
sides of the fence, which
arm.
tells me they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And they're going to try everything. And that's what I think Bertelsmann should do.
Yeah.
That's what Google's going to do.
Well,
That's what-
Bertelsmann is starting to do that because they have opened several e-book brand things where you can go and you still have to get through an artificial selection process, but the selection process is much, it's to get a, they probably, let's say Bertelsmann, the Random House empire in North America probably maybe receives, 20,000 book proposals a year, and from which they publish 20 books or whatever, or 100 books. It's probably more like 100,000 book proposals from which they publish 100 books. In this case, they would probably be publishing 1,000 books or 2,000. But the hilarious model is it's completely designed to prey on people who want to get books out there. They want to they're not good enough in the corporate mindset to have real books, and they don't want to self-publish, so they want the imprimatur of a Random House, and so the contracts that are being offered are 50-50 split, so you get 50% of the money, they get 50% of the money, but Random House will take unspecified amounts of money out for promotions, for distribution fees, and if they make a print book out of it, they will take the money that it costs to make the print book out of what you're going to receive. And in fact, you would be much better off simply publishing direct to Amazon and Kobo and all these places. So they're trying to throw things against the window while maintaining the one thing that they possess, the one thing that they have, which is really their brand and their name, because what else do they have that is in control? But I think this whole question of scarcity and abundance, right? So on the internet, you have this unbelievable abundance of books being published, and then you have a shrinking number of books being published in print through both mainstream and independent small presses, and so you're like, well, what is going on here? And the simple fact of the matter is that nobody is reading this stuff online. I'm being facetious, but certainly in a literary context, nobody's reading that material. And in the book publishing print book, fewer and fewer people are reading those books too. So what are people doing? They're on the streetcar playing Angry Birds when they used to have a book, and they were reading a book. They're not reading anymore. So I'm not saying people aren't reading. I'm saying the numbers are down across the board. The amount of books being published, anyone can publish a book. The censorship, if we want to use that word, extends across the board to the media. The media will not touch a self-published book with a 200-foot pole.
Unless it's 50 Shades of Grey and sold in many copies.
Well, 50 Shades of Grey is Jesse's proverbial, win the jackpot, and they still weren't really all touching it until it was published in print form by a mainstream company. So there's these, there's always the tiny exception. But reality is they won't touch it, they won't talk about it, it has no legitimacy. And if it has no legitimacy in that sense, it can't find readers, right? And the only real exception to that are genre books, horror, detective stuff, mystery stuff, Harlequin type romance stuff, 50 Shades of Grey stuff. Those are the only exceptions to this rule, and even in them, it's vastly, vastly overstated that you're going to write your werewolf lesbian novel and it's gonna, you're going to self-publish it and you're going to sell hundreds of thousands of copies. At best, you might sell 10,000 copies. That would be
or 10.
That would be a success. But that 10,000 copies, you would have to sell them at 99 cents a piece. You would have to invest so much time and energy to sell them, and ultimately, if you did the numbers, you would see that you made $7.95 an hour to accomplish this. So the whole thing is just an unbelievable mess. I should have taken up professional bowling. It would have been more profitable and less perplexing.
Jesse, I wanted to return to your idea of a publishing house kind of throwing open the doors and publishing everything they can get their hands on. To me, that seems it would do a disservice not only to writers, but readers too, because suddenly it's how do you discover books if Random House is publishing 1 million a year? I mean, just from my point of view, that would be a nightmare. I'm getting 300 books across my desk as it is every week, and if Random House suddenly, quadruples their output, how do I, if I can't keep on top of things, how as a reader, it seems, there'd be less, you know what I mean, less and less books being read.
But you just both answered my question and reinforced my underlying principle, which is, on the one hand, aggregators, curators, have become the new power. So the value of the Random House brand is never going to be in scarcity. So in opening the gates to abundance, what they can do, and they're doing this through Hazlitt, they hope, is to actually play the role of telling you what you like, but you cannot do that in a mass market scale. And you have been giving the market so much data about your interests, about your likes, about the ads you see, about the stuff you read, that they can figure out, okay, we know exactly what he wants to read. We'll set up a personalized service where we're going to publish so much stuff that we can maximize what the mobile industry calls ARPU, the average revenue per user. Because on the one hand, yeah, maybe Hal's right, the number of readers has declined. But the people who are still reading probably have more money today because they're aging and they're amassing more wealth. So if you could individually, using big data, target each of these readers and have a boatload of content to feed them on all of their interests, all of their niches, you could make way more money and be that new gatekeeper.
The only problem with your scheme is it eliminates writers who want to spend, say, the unbelievable, ridiculous, utopian dream of, 2 years intensely investigating a subject and writing a great book on that subject. Because nothing in your model will produce that money that I need to do that.
What I earlier talked about, but did not link to this model, but I will make clear for the purposes of our experiment here, is I reject when people in the industry say, well, the market doesn't want that, or the market demand isn't there. I always reject that, because I'm always like, you don't know the market. Like, where's your data? There's no data there to support your statement, because let me finish this point. So if we opened up the gates and had all this content there, the byproduct of that content is data. So we will start seeing who likes what and which likes what. So it'll be easier for you, Hal, to say, I need $100,000 to do a 2-year project, and here's why I think it would be interesting. And there'd actually be data, finally, to say, yeah, Hal's right. The market for this would justify this $100,000 investment, so we could do that. Now, it's largely whim, and it's incomplete data. Whereas if you open it up a la social media and get into the world of big data, where you're harvesting a ton, then you can actually make the case as to where the market is and do the investment accordingly.
Now, I mean, I'd argue there already is data, and publishers are already using it against writers. I might be talking about a different kind of data than what you're referring to, but here in Canada, we have BookNet Canada, which tracks 90% of book sales in this country. And a lot of times when a new writer, or when a writer is pitching their new book, the publishers will look at the data and say, you sold 800 copies, pass.
But
so...
I mean, obviously, without restating my hypothesis, the reason I feel that data is flawed is I don't feel that the participants in that system, i.e. the people getting published, are a fair representation of what the market can supply.
But they're the readers.
First, no. What I'm saying is the readers do not have, like I, for example, do not have a book on the market. So there is no data for anyone to tell you whether my book would meet with the market. But if anyone could enter the market, so if there were tons of writers putting tons of stuff out there, then you'd have a more complete data set. Because instead of it just being the people who the gatekeepers are allowed to pass, which I have previously stated I feel is corrupt, instead you'd actually have an open system. So anyone could get into the system, which would create a more broader data set that's more universal, so that I would then feel the confidence as a writer that there's enough people similar to me in the system that the data can be comparable. Whereas now, as a technology person, I look at all the technology books published, Tapscott, and they suck. And they all suck so much that I go, no way could the stuff that I have to offer compare to the stuff that's in the market.
In fact, the better the book, the worse it will do. That's what my data tells me. I don't have Jesse's faith in data, perhaps because I have an artist sensibility and I don't give a shit what the data says about my next project or not, and I don't want to live a data-driven life when I sit down to write a book. I have abundant evidence that data has destroyed publishing. There's all those problems. It's too bad we don't have a publisher here to haplessly attempt to defend their
Would that be fair, though?
miserable record. Of course it would be fair. They would probably never do it. If you want to come on and talk about economic censorship, at a public forum, what's in it for them to do that? It would be. I've had these conversations privately with publishers, and they agree with everything I say, and then they continue doing exactly what they do, because it is a systemic problem. The people in publishing are delightful, erudite, kind, scholarly people who lament desperately the fact that there's no place for me in their system. And I totally accept that they genuinely do lament it, although they do not quit or register any kind of
Stage a revolution.
Yeah, they don't register any kind of meaningful
But you feel
protest.
better.
I feel less like physically assaulting the person.
So maybe they just did it for survival.
I mean, which I don't know, I see what Jesse's point is, and I kind of think that way too. For instance,
Well, we know we're living in a world that is controlled by people who think that way.
Yes.
yeah,
And that's
yeah.
because, Mark's point is absolutely right. They come back and they say, well, you've only averaged 650 copies of your last 3 collections of short stories or something, and
Yeah.
therefore you're dead in the water.
And I mean, do we really need to get into why that's wrong? Why that would be? There's so many reasons why.
I know that. I know.
But I work in a field where I personally am critical of technology. I feel the average person is critical of technology, but nobody could say, let's turn the internet off, or let's get rid of smartphones. Like there isn't this perception you can stand up to the tsunami of technology. And House of Cards on Netflix is a pivotal part in the TV industry where data is now going to dramatically influence the purchasing of TV shows. Because Netflix spent $100 million on 2 seasons of House of Cards based purely on data. And it looks as if it's going to pay off for them. And the ripples that this has created amongst the people who buy entertainment, which is called the Canadian television industry because they don't really create anything, they just buy, that they feel that the advantage is going to be to those who have the data. And that's part of the reason they're all going to set up Netflix-like services so they can gather data on specifically what you're watching, when you watch it, when you tune off, And ebooks provide similar data.
No,
So
no,
Amazon, I
that's,
assume,
that's
is-
wrong because TV and the publishing of literature were once polar opposites, and this is, again, this comes back to what killed publishing. What killed publishing was the adoption of the TV model. We need to have that book in every house, just like the goal of every channel in Canada.
But this mentality is pervasive, and it's pervasive among the problem is that, as with so much of globalization, you can't fight against it because you end up adopting the language yourself. So how do people fight against the decline of reading? They fight against the decline of reading by saying, what is the one book everybody should read this month? What is it's still imposing a monoculture, right? I mean, that's actually, these one-book campaigns or Canada Reads, these are actually the death of literature, because literature is a chorus of voices. It's a variety of different modes. And the moment you say, we're going to save reading by having one book everybody should read, sorry, you're part of the corporate mentality.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, but I mean, I think it's, you got to take that with a grain of salt. Like the death of literature is not coming about because, some people, a bunch of people are going to read Fahrenheit, are going to read Ray Bradbury in April, but
No.
I take the point. I think
example.
the bigger issue, though, is crap like what the CBC does with its battle for the book and
it's
East
horrible.
versus West,
It's horrible.
and again, it's the TVization of reading and kind
of literary discussion.
and inevitably the book that wins.
But this is why what frustrates me is we're still talking, legitimately so, about the TVization of culture. When are we going to have the conversation about the internetization of culture? And it feels that while the music industry, after 20 years of kicking and streaming, is now finally having that, TV industry isn't. Book industry, sort of, but still not really. And that's where I find the internet continues to be this kind of bogeyman I was saying that every industry kind of stays away from. And that's where I personally kind of, wrestle with the idea of, well, moving beyond just the ebook. I mean, are there people, is the next great novel, is the next great author tweeting? And is all of their tweets being, and can that, here's where I kind of really wrestle with it, will that ever be a book? Or will it just be tweets? Will they be the great literary mind who can only communicate
But
100
it's already been a book. Like we've had Shit My Dad Said. The book.
No,
Shit My
but
Dad Said,
I
the
mean
TV
someone,
series
that's not what I'm
with
saying.
William
That's not what I'm
Shatner,
saying. I mean someone who so poetically, so perfectly evokes the medium that it can't be translated. So it can't be Shit My Dad Says.
Well,
it's only something like, man, did you read that? Yo, you gotta go on Twitter to read that. And there's nowhere else you could read it.
I think that, to draw on a point Hal was making about people on streetcars sitting there like this rather than, 20 years ago they might have been like this. I think once you get onto the screen, you're into a different medium, and in a way you're not even talking about literature anymore. There is going to be some great multimedia internet artist out there. And there are going to be a whole generation of them probably. But what they create will not be what we would call literature. It will be something completely different that will be dependent on having the screen rather than the page as its support system.
And God help them, because when we think about economic censorship and the potential for censorship, this idea that everything should go through the internet frightens me even more, because we are starting to see some really egregious examples of censorship within companies like Twitter and Facebook. The companies are happy to do it. The countries are happy to do it. The service providers are happy to do it as long as we maintain the status quo.
Yep.
And and the checks keep coming. So I mean, the internet is it's not the utopian solution to all these problems. In fact, in many ways, it could be the totalitarian dream. It's not right now. It's in the middle, like everything else. I mean, I don't think we figured these things out.
No, we're in a transitional stage.
Sitting here pissed off that I wasn't born in 19 whatever. 45, so that, you know,
Good career would be ending by now.
yeah, I
right.
could have been
I mean,
reaping my reward, my just rewards.
the other thing, of course, is that it's a lot easier to delete things online. And I was talking to a friend who said that the McGill...
A lot easier than what?
Well, books are... It's difficult to track down every copy of a book. They get into people's basements, one gets hidden. For example, an early example of censorship. When the Spaniards arrived in what's now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, that area, they discovered the local people were reading books. Now, since these books were not Catholic religious books, they decided they must be the work of the devil, and they tried to burn them all. Now, fortunately for us, they weren't completely successful. They were extremely diligent, and they almost did it. But the result is that 4 of these books have survived. And so we have some idea of what Mayan written culture was like. But if the Mayans had been using the internet, the Spaniards could have taken over their culture, pressed the delete button, and it would have disappeared completely.
But do you think it's that easy? I mean, just playing devil's advocate,
Sure.
it would seem to me once something is online, it can kind of filter through.
It can be downloaded.
Yeah,
or,
it can kind of.
Yeah, maybe, but I still think it's easier to wipe it out than it is with a printed book, which can diffuse through the culture in all sorts of unexpected ways. And I mean, I was talking to somebody who told me the McGill Library now is refusing to buy physical books if the e-book is available. So again, you've got a whole bunch of new material now that is potentially deletable.
But isn't the myth of the internet so wonderful that we ascribe to it this divine librarian power, that we just assume that everything's always going to be out there? But on the contrary, the stuff that will be used against us will always be out there. But the stuff that we want to be there won't be. And I can sort of look in the room and get a general sense of age. Like the emails I wrote in the 90s are gone. Like gone, completely gone, ain't coming back. And there was I could have made efforts to preserve them. In theory, maybe I wanted, at some point the letters of Jesse Hirsh, right, might have been made for, but there ain't going to be that. And like I was thinking about this the other day, I still have my emails from the aughts. I probably won't when we make it to the 20s, because why would I keep those things? What benefit? And, the internet is all sorts of great things in theory. But in practice, how we use the internet, the devil of that details, is where everything goes completely different from these theories that we hold to so well. And, that was where I was talking about how ebooks could be done this way versus ebooks could be done that way. But the point of preserving ideas, but more importantly, in preserving dissenting ideas, I think has already disappeared. And for example, like social media is often mistakenly called conversational media. And I find that to be the biggest oxymoron, because it's impossible to have a civil conversation in social media with people who disagree with you. Right? Consensus is easy online.
Shut up, Nazi.
Bingo! and Hal knows that there is actually a formula of how long an online discussion goes before Hitler Nazism is born. Right? And it's very difficult to go against conventional thinking.
Yes.
And conventional thinking on the internet is overwhelmingly either deleted or suppressed, because no one goes to the 200th page of Google results. And it's phenomenal. Like I obviously benefit from the persona and institutional authority CBC Radio gives me. But all people got to do is go to my 3rd or 4th Google results. When you Google me, you'll find some pretty incriminating stuff that gives a total other image of Jesse that nobody ever goes to. It's absolutely phenomenal how all these secrets are out in plain sight. So I don't need to delete them, because no one looks at them.
We're lazy.
Yeah, which comes back down. But nonetheless, things are deleted all the time. And your point about the conquerors deleting it, the United States has cyber weapons, which they brag about, which they can launch this cyber weapon via the internet and wipe out military data, corporate
They're going to
data.
destroy CanLit once and for all. You know what? Enough.
I think I see
That 1.3% market share of the CanLit, that they could be buying good old-fashioned American books.
And I guess to that point, I mean, sometimes cyber weapons aren't even necessary. You have corporations like Google who are more than happy to help, for example, the Chinese government suppress information they don't want its citizens to read. And so, I mean, we've been talking about new gatekeepers, I guess there's an example.
Well, and let's not pick on China. I mean, if you wanted to look at photos of Beyonce the day after the Super Bowl,
Right, yeah.
in theory, the U.S. government would have said that's illegal because it's copied by copyright law. And in the U.S., the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is regularly used as a means of censorship, as a way to remove content from the internet. And sites like YouTube, major sites, have automated this so it can happen in seconds. And it's phenomenal when and where it happens. There are celebrated cases of those of us who support freedom of expression rallying to fight against it. But increasingly that will come with penalty.
Well,
Meaning
shouldn't
losing your
freedom
internet
of
access.
expression have some sort of at least market value or cost? I mean, one thing that irritates me as a writer about the internet is, in the old days, if I wrote an article that people thought was interesting, and it appeared in, say, the Montreal Gazette, which I wrote for a few years, you'd get, somebody would say, oh, well, we'd like to republish this in the Edmonton Journal. We'll pay you $150 to republish it. And yeah, we'd like to republish it in Lethbridge, and we'll repay you $100. Now they just say, we're going to take your column off for the website of your magazine. We'll put a link to your webpage up there to pay you. So that's undermining the
And
economic viability of being a writer.
Let's be frank, you're lucky to get the link. Right? I mean, the way it works on the internet, they're just going to take your stuff. And, you know, and the mainstream media do all the time. How often do you see video? I don't watch TV.
But what you see when that happens, I start to think, well, maybe the Americans are right to regulate the internet and enforce copyright law.
Well, but that's a separate discussion on a separate night. But if you look at the news, they'll often take video from YouTube and credit YouTube rather than credit the user.
The users,
Yeah,
yeah.
Right?
If YouTube has
Yeah,
produced
yeah. Which
anything.
speaks to
Yeah.
how that notion of not copyright, but authorship
is
has
being
been
effaced
diluted,
and
has
effaced.
been changed.
Yeah.
And that I would lament, that
Yeah.
authorship is something that could easily still be addressed,
Right.
separate from overarching copyright enforcement.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a cultural shift we're seeing that, again, comes back to this question of, you might call it economic censorship, you might call it accidental censorship, that authorship disappears. You know, the idea that someone has to toil to make a work of communication somehow gets lost, and it's all just sort of, well, if you're not going to do it, someone else will do it. We'll hire people, as these
Well, we'll get people to do it for
99-cent
free.
books.
We'll get people to do it for
we'll
free.
outsource it to Sri Lanka. They'll write the books. If you think it's too much trouble to write a book in 3 months and sell it for 99 cents. So I mean, you keep coming back to these problems that are. They do have solutions. I think they do have solutions, but the solutions demand political will and acknowledgement of the systemic problems that we're facing, and I don't think that either of those things are likely to occur in my lifetime.
Because I wanted to leave some time for audience questions, and it's past 8 o'clock right now, I wanted to talk briefly about a topic Stephen is very familiar with, being a translator and works in translation. How do you think digital culture has affected the translation market?
So far as I can see, it hasn't had any impact at all, really. I mean, I think the issues around translation are issues that are cultural issues that have to do with the way in which different cultures interact and perceive each other, and they're not so much, at least at this stage, and this may change, but they're not so much technological issues. Most governments have promoted translation policy or shaped translation policy to promote political agendas of a certain type. It's sort of difficult to remember this now, but in the 1940s, the US actually promoted the translation of Russian books and made Russian books widely available very cheaply as part of the war effort and building up friendly feelings towards Russia, who were also fighting the Nazis. And so it became, I mean, my dad, who grew up in dire poverty in New York, tells me that one of the few books he could afford were often these wartime translations of Tolstoy or Chekhov that had been made available to promote the war effort. And you get, so, and then you see as soon as the war ends, suddenly all this US money government money goes into setting up Japanese translation program at the University of Michigan, because Japan is suddenly the bulwark against both China and Russia in the Cold War. So it's always been used in a political way. Sometimes those political signals are confused. I mean, one good example of that is Latin American literature in the 1960s. After the Cuban Revolution, there was a strong desire on the part of the US government to both co-opt the sort of upsurge of Latin American culture and to kind of neutralize the Cuban Revolution. And often these worked at cross purposes with each other. I mean, if you look at the career of someone like Carlos Fuentes, late Mexican author, he, in the 60s, the Ford Foundation lavished huge amounts of money on getting his novels translated in order to foster better relations with Latin America and make sure that Mexico wouldn't go the same way as Cuba. And yet, every time he tried to come to the States to promote one of these books, the State Department would bar him from entering the country because he had visited Cuba. So the translation policy, is like any other policy, can work at cross purposes. I mean, in Canada, it's been used entirely, I think, as a nation-building tool. So the only translations that we fund are French-English, English-French within Canada. Britain, by contrast, funds incoming translations. So if you're a British translator and you want to translate hot new work from Thailand or Russia, you can actually get British government funding to do it. In the States, there are private foundations that will help you. And just to put in a plug for the Biblioasis International Translation Series, one reason we started doing this was because there wasn't, and so far as we could see, hadn't ever been a publisher in Canada that was devoted to doing incoming translations, not just English, French, French, English within Canada.
And I'll add a note to this question of translation that, and I think this is kind of an addendum to the whole situation of what's happening with publishing, is that the Harper government really just decimated all opportunities for Canadian writers to have their works promoted and adopted in other countries. So there was quite a lot of support for, say, a Polish Canadian studies program to teach Canadian books and bring over Canadian writers, and they would also send over students from their program to learn in Canada. And all this was funded by the government, and all of that has been eliminated. Yeah. And I think, again, the connection here is, well, you know, the market will provide that, and the big top books, you know, if they emerge out of Canadian corporate publishing, you know, they can just be published in the Polish Random House subsidiary, and it'll all be fine. So I mean, I think that's the thinking. What's the point of this? So, you know, even as everything else is happening, translation opportunities and opportunities to develop foreign markets for, again, the Midlist, and the small press writers are shrinking.
In the first wave of globalization, post-1990, that was supposed to be how the Canadian Midlist was going to survive. Mm-hmm. You were going to publish your book in Canada, okay, there's a limit to the Canadian market, but don't worry, you'll make lots of foreign rights sales.
Yeah, you were going to be big. I was going to be big in Germany.
Yeah, yeah.
What
I had an invitation to teach in Austria canceled when they cut that funding. I mean, you know, it's not a big deal for me, but it's a big deal, I think, for Canadian
It's a big deal
culture.
For the Austrians.
Maybe a big deal for the Austrians. Who knows what they missed out on. But it is striking that actually we have a government that adheres so closely to the market doctrine that it has absolved itself of the usual responsibilities of promoting the national culture overseas. They've cut all funding for promoting the national culture overseas, which has very few countries in history have ever done. And that's one reason why, when you go abroad now, fewer and fewer people know anything about us.